On the morning of September 18, 2013, two respected men of God left Oakland, California, on what they described to their congregations as a pilgrimage into creation. Pastor Elijah Brooks, 47, known for his passionate sermons and easy laughter, and Pastor David Carter, 50, fatherly figure, were more than spiritual leaders. They were brothers in faith, lifelong friends, and fathers of families who adored them. Their plan was simple: to spend 4 days camping Yosemite National Park, a retreat to pray, write, and reflect away from the noise of city life. The trip had been months in the making. Elijah had spoken of it during a Bible study session, explaining that he wanted to walk where silence is louder than the world. David, ever the historian, carried with him not only his Bible, but also a leather-bound journal in which he intended to record scripture reflections and observations of the wild. Their families supported the retreat, seeing it as an extension of their calling, though some expressed unease about the vast wilderness of Yosemite. Still, the men brushed aside concerns, promising they would be back by Sunday to deliver their sermons. The night before their departure, Elijah texted his wife a simple message: "Pray for us. We want to feel God in the mountain." David called his daughter, leaving her with a reminder to stay strong in her studies and not to worry. Friends recall that both men seemed unusually serene in the days leading up to the trip, as though they carried a private certainty that this journey was necessary. Neither man had expressed fear or hesitation. Instead, their voices brimmed with anticipation, as if the forest itself was calling them. Early that morning, Elijah loaded up his gray Toyota SUV with camping gear: tents, sleeping bags, lanterns, and a small propane stove. David tucked away a carefully folded blanket his late wife had sewn, saying he wanted her memory to be with him under the stars. In the back seat, alongside food and supplies, lay 2 well-worn Bibles, one with Elijah's scribbled annotations, the other marked by David's steady handwriting. Before leaving Oakland, they stopped by their church, where several congregants gathered in the parking lot to pray over them. Witnesses describe a moving moment as the two pastors stood side by side, heads bowed, while friends and parishioners laid hands on. It felt like sending off missionary. Later told. The pastors promised to return with stories, photographs, maybe even sermons inspired by the mountain. Someone snapped a picture smiling against the backdrop, a photograph that later became a haunting reminder of the last time they were seen alive in the city. Their route was straightforward: Interstate 580, Sierra Nevada, then winding roads into Yosemite's majestic. Along the way, Elijah sent one last message to his teenage son: "When I get back, we'll go. Don't forget I love you." David, less inclined to texting, simply told his son at breakfast to see him Sunday evening. Those messages, simple and routine, would later take on an unbearable weight for the families who replayed them endlessly after the disappearance. By late afternoon, they entered Yosemite National Park, their entry confirmed by a ranger at the Tioga Pass station. The two men joked with the ranger, asking for the best place to catch sunrise before driving deeper into the park. The ranger later described them as good-spirited, respectful, and excited, nothing out of the ordinary. Their destination was the Tuolumne Meadows area, a vast expanse of alpine forest and granite domes, a place where the immensity of nature can feel both breathtaking and isolated. That evening, the sun lowered behind El Capitan, Elijah and David set up their camp. Other visitors remembered hearing two men singing softly around a fire, hymns carried faintly cold mountain air. They took one last photograph with the granite cliffs behind them, holding a Bible between them as though it were the very heart of their trip. Smiling, they looked every bit like men at peace. No one could have imagined that a week later their tent would be discovered under chillingly different circumstances. Yosemite National Park, sprawling across nearly 750,000 acres of granite cliffs, alpine meadows, towering pines, has always been a place of wonder. To the unprepared, its beauty can be deceiving. Temperatures plunge without warning, trails vanish into tangled undergrowth, and predators roam its silent valley. For Elijah Brooks and David Carter, however, the park was not a place to fear, but revere. They saw it as a cathedral sculpted by God himself, where mountains replaced stained glass and streams. In their mind, there could be no holier retreat. The pastors set up camp near Tuolumne Meadows, a broad subalpine grassland, 8,600 feet above sea level. Known for its pristine lakes and views of distant peaks, it was also notorious for its sudden weather shifts. One moment, the sky stretched clear and endless. The next, fog rolled in like a shroud, swallowing the horizon. That week, forecasts predicted dropping temperature and light snowfall in higher elevation. Yet both men, experienced hikers and campers, appeared unconcerned. Their journals, later recovered, show they wrote about the silence of the trees and the weight of God's hand upon the stillness. Nearby campers would later recall fleeting encounters. A family from Fresno remembered passing them along the trail as the pastors cheerfully asked for directions to a good overlook. A solo backpacker said he heard faint singing one night. Old hymns carried through the darkness. To many, the pair seemed content, grounded, and very much in tune with their environment. Their campfire conversations, as reported by one hiker who joined briefly, revolved around faith, hope, and the need to disconnect from the material world. On the evening of September 18th, the men sent their last communications to their families. Elijah texted his wife a photograph of the valley floor glowing orange under the sun, captioned simply, "He is here." Meir, David left a voicemail for his daughter, his voice warm and calm. "We're safe, sweetheart. Don't worry, we'll be home soon." After that, no further messages. Within 24 hours, their phones would fall silent. What had begun as a serene retreat was already slipping toward something inexplicable. The weather turned quickly on the 19th. Park records confirm a sudden cold front descended that night, bringing heavy mist and biting winds. Visibility dropped to almost nothing in some areas, forcing rangers to warn visitors to stay near trails. Yet no one reported seeing the pastor that evening. Their campsite, nestled among trees, seemed shielded from the worst of the elements. But isolation in such conditions could be dangerous. Still, there was no sign of panic, no attempt to leave the area, no signal for help. 2 days later, on September 20th, Elijah's wife tried calling repeatedly. Each call went straight to voicemail. She assumed they were out of range, but unease began to gnaw at her. By Saturday, David's son drove to their Oakland church to ask if anyone had heard from his father. The congregation reassured him surely the men were simply caught up in their spiritual retreat. Yet by Sunday evening, when both pastors failed to appear for their services, alarm turned into fear. Something was wrong. Their last confirmed image, taken by a passing hiker with whom they briefly spoke, would later become iconic in coverage of the case. It showed the two men smiling broadly, framed by the colossal granite face of El Capitan. One clutched a Bible. The other raised his hand in a small wave. It was an image of peace, of devotion, and of friendship. But viewed later, it seemed more like a farewell portrait, frozen in time before everything unraveled. It was the last undisputed proof that Elijah Brooks and David Carter were alive and well. And then nothing. No more sightings, no more message. Yosemite, vast and indifferent, swallowed them whole. By Monday morning, their families filed official missing persons, setting into motion a chain of events that would grip not just California, but the entire serene beauty of what was about to become the backdrop for one of its most chilling mysteries. When Monday, September 23, 2013, arrived without word from Elijah or David, the family's unease turned into dread. Both men had promised to be home by Sunday evening to preach their sermons, a commitment neither had ever broken in decades of ministry. Their absence was not just unusual, it was unthinkable. Elijah's wife, Rachel, tried to steady her voice. She called Yosemite's ranger station, asking if anyone had reported trouble on the trails. The ranger on duty reassured her, noting that hikers often lost signal and returned late. But Rachel felt something was wrong. By mid-afternoon, panic spread among family and church members. David's son, Marcus, drove to the couple's Oakland church, pacing the aisles. He called his father's cell phone over and over. It rang once, Marcus later told reporters, then it just went dead. After that, only voicemail. Elijah's teenage son scrolled endless his phone, rereading the last text his father had. "We'll go fishing when I get back. Forget, I love you." The message, once ordinary, now felt like a goodbye at stone. That same evening, members of both congregations gathered in the church basement, their faces drawn with fear. They prayed aloud, voices rising and falling like waves, asking God to protect the two men and guide rescuers to them. Some spoke hopefully of car trouble, of a delay caused by weather. Others whispered darker fears, an accident, a fall, or worse. One elderly member admitted she had dreamt of Elijah standing in the forest, silent, unable to speak. The dream chilled her to the bone. By Tuesday morning, the National Park Service classified the pastors as missing persons. Rangers contacted nearby campsites and lodges, circulating photographs and description. Elijah, 6'1", broad-shouldered, with a graying beard. David, 5'9", bespectacled, with a warm, steady smile. Witnesses recalled them setting up camp. Others swore they heard singing in the night, but no one had seen them since Thursday. With each negative sighting, the mystery deepened. How could two men simply vanish in a park teeming with visitors? The Brooks and Carter families drove to Yosemite that same day, their vehicles packed with water, blankets, and an irrational hope that they might find the men walking alone. Journalists caught up with them outside the rangers, capturing raw emotion. Rachel's voice cracked. Elijah knows he knows the outdoors. He wouldn't just disappear. David's daughter clutched a photograph of her father, unable to hold back tears. Their grief was only sharpened by the uncertainty. They were trapped between hope and despair. Back in Oakland, the community was restless. Vigils were organized, candles lit in front of the church. Flyers with the pastor's photographs spread across neighborhoods. Radio hosts and local news anchors repeated the same haunting line: two respected Oakland pastors missing in Yosemite. The story spread beyond California, stirring attention nationwide. People struggled to reconcile the image of the joyful men in Yosemite with the growing silence that followed. Every unanswered call, every day without a trace, stretched like an eternity. Investigators reviewed the pastor's last communication, Elijah's final photo of the sunset, David's voicemail promising his daughter not to worry. Nothing seemed ominous, no hints of fear or confusion. Their campsite reservation confirmed they planned to stay until Sunday morning, yet they had vanished before then, leaving no clear time. Rangers noted that most disappearances involved hikers venturing off trail, but the pastors had left no sign. It was as if they had been swallowed by the forest without a sound. By the end of the third day, the tone had shifted. What began as a delay now looked like, with darkness falling, the temperature plunging in Tuolumne Meadows, authorities prepared to launch a large-scale search. Helicopters, dogs, and dozens of rangers would be deployed, but already whispers spread among the families and volunteers. This felt different. Something was wrong beyond the usual dangers of Yosemite, and no one could shake the feeling that silence itself was hiding. At dawn on September 24, 2013, the official search began in earnest. Yosemite Rangers coordinated with the National Park Service, deploying more than 40 personnel across the Tuolumne Meadows region. Helicopters circled above, their searchlights cutting through fog that clung stubbornly to the granite cliffs. On the ground, search and rescue teams moved in grid paths, calling the pastors' names, their voices muffled by the immensity of the wilderness. From the outset, conditions were frigid nights, biting wind, visibility reduced to only a few yards in places. Volunteers poured in from across California. Congregants from both churches drove hours to join their bright jackets flashing against They fanned out along trails, clutching photographs of Elijah and David, showing them to strangers in case anyone had seen the men. A few brought therapy dogs, believing even untrained noses. But as the hours dragged on, the wilderness seemed indifferent to their plea. Not a single footprint, broken branch, or scrap of clothing emerged. Helicopters reported difficulty navigating the rugged terrain. Narrow canyons created dangerous wind currents, and the mist thickened unpredictably, grounding several flights. Rangers scoured ravines where hikers often slipped, rappelling into shadowed depth. They expected, at the very least, to find discarded gear, a trail leading away from the campsite, or even signs of wildlife disturbance. Instead, they found nothing. The campsite, when visited by searchers, appeared eerily undisturbed, as though the men had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. The lack of evidence gnawed at investigators. Normally, even the most tragic accidents leave clues: a jacket snagged on a branch, a trail of prints leading to water, a backpack abandoned near a ledge. Here, there was silence, an absence that felt unnatural. It was like they vanished into thin air. One ranger admitted anonymous, "People don't just disappear without leaving a trace. Not out here, not two grown men together." The mystery unsettled even the most experienced searcher. Interviews with other campers only deepened the strangeness. A backpacker reported hearing distant singing on Thursday night, But by Friday morning, the forest was silent. Another swore she saw two figures walking along a ridge at dusk, but she could not confirm if they were Elijah and David. Conflicting accounts muddied the timeline. Rangers logged every sighting, every rumor, but nothing connected into a coherent picture. As days passed, the possibility that the men had wandered far from their campsite grew less and less likely. Back in Oakland, media coverage intensified. National outlets picked up the story, describing the disappearance of two beloved pastors as both tragic and baffling. News crews set up outside the Yosemite Ranger Station, capturing footage of searchers setting out each morning. Family members gave tearful interviews, pleading for prayers and help. The nation's attention, briefly, focused on the men who had gone into Yosemite seeking peace but found only silence. Pressure on rangers mounted, but still no progress. Search dogs added another strange element. Brought to the campsite, they picked up a faint trail leading only a few yards into the woods before losing it entirely. Handlers tried multiple times, circling wide, but the result was always the same. The scent vanished abruptly, as though swallowed by the air. That doesn't happen often, one handler later admitted. There's usually continuity, even faint, like walking into a void. The unsettling detail fueled speculation that something unusual had happened. By the end of the first week, frustration gave way to despair. The official search radius had stretched to over 30 square miles, yet not a single piece of definitive evidence had surfaced. Family members stayed in nearby lodges, waiting for news, clinging to hope. But among the searchers, a grim realization was setting in. Whatever had happened to Elijah Brooks and Carter was not going to be explained easily. And in the wilderness of Yosemite, time was running out. On the morning of September 25, 2013, a ranger patrol moving through a less-traveled section of forest stumbled upon something that froze them in their tracks. Tucked deep among fir trees, partially obscured by brush, lay a collapsed tent. The sight at first seemed ordinary, another forgotten campsite left behind by careless hikers. But as they approached, the rangers realized it matched the description of the gear Elijah and David had carried. The tent was not where it should have been. It was miles away from their registered site at Tuolumne. The tent itself was in disarray. One pole snapped, the canvas slumped like a body against the earth. Around it, belongings were scattered haphazardly. A lantern overturned, a folded map soaked from dew, and a half-empty bag of trail mix spilling into the dirt. Yet strangely, no wildlife had touched the food. The air around the campsite was eerily still, thick, the silence the rangers later described as unnatural. The sense of wrongness deepened when one ranger pulled back the tent flap and saw what lay inside. Two sleeping bags lay unzipped and partially unfurled, as though the men had climbed out in haste. Beside them, boots stuck awkwardly from the shadows, protruding into the pale daylight. The rangers' stomachs turned as they realized they were not empty. Two bodies were inside. Elijah and David, side by side, lay motionless in the tent, their faces pale and strangely serene, as if caught between sleep and prayer. No blood, no signs of struggle, only stillness. The scene was chillingly quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. What unsettled investigators further was what lay between the men. On the ground, open to the book of Revelation, was Elijah's Bible. Several verses were underlined in red ink. Neither family member recognized as belonging to him. Next to the book, a small scrap of a single phrase scrawled, "He is not holy." The handwriting was jagged, frantic, and neither family nor congregation members could identify. Immediately, speculation about its origin began. Even more disturbing was the discovery on the inner canvas of the tent. Scrawled in red pigment, almost like paint or thick ink, was a crude symbol, a circle broken by a vertical slash, intersected by jagged lines. Experts later admitted they could not identify as belonging to any known religious or occult system. To the rangers, it looked like something hastily drawn in a moment of fear or obsession. Some whispered it resembled a distorted cross, while others thought it looked more like a warning mark. The ambiguity only fueled unease. Investigators moved quickly to secure the scene, treating it as a potential crime site. Photographs were taken, samples collected, and the bodies removed for autopsy. The area was cordoned off, but word of the discovery leaked almost immediately. Within hours, news outlets broadcast chilling headline: Missing pastors found dead in Yosemite tent, strange message left behind. For the families, the revelation brought both relief and horror. They finally knew where Elijah and David were, but not how or why they had died. Disturbing autopsy results would later complicate matters rather than clarify. Neither man bore signs of trauma, struggle, or attack. Toxicology screens revealed no poisons, no drugs, nothing to suggest self-harm. Their bodies showed only minor scratches consistent with hiking, but nothing life-threatening. Cause of death was listed as undetermined. Authorities, pressed by reporters, admitted they were baffled. "We don't know what happened inside that tent," one official, and the writings we found raise more questions. For the families, grief turned into torment. Rachel Brooks sobbed as she asked reporters, "What does 'he is not gone' mean? Who wrote it?" David's daughter demanded answers from investigators, furious at the lack of explanation. The Oakland congregations mourned, but rumors spread quickly, blending grief with fear. Cult activity, foul play, or something unearthly filled the pews. The tent and its strange marking became the center of one of Yosemite's most haunting mysteries, and the silence surrounding it was only beginning to deepen. From the moment photographs of the tent were reviewed by investigators, the strange red symbol became the focus of every conversation. Experts in religious iconography were consulted, but none could provide a definitive interpretation. Some suggested it was an improvised variation of an early Christian Chi-Rho. Others said it resembled pagan warning symbol, while a few whispered it was nothing more than a panicked doodle. Yet its placement, painted directly above where the pastors' bodies were found, chilling. It seemed less like random graffiti. The families were adamant that neither Elijah nor David would have drawn such a mark. "That's not their faith," Rachel Brooks said firmly in an interview. "They wouldn't deface their tent with something so ugly." David's son agreed, saying his father's journals contained only prayers, reflection, and gentle reminders, never strange symbols or cryptic words. Investigators examined the pigment, expecting it to be blood, but lab analysis revealed it was some kind of paint mixed with soil. Where the paint had come from remained a mystery. No container was ever recovered at the site. Even more disturbing were the pastor's journals, recovered from the campsite. Elijah's handwriting began normally. Reflections on the majesty of Yosemite, Bible verses, prayers for his family. But by September 19th, his entries grew fragmented. "The silence is too loud," line read. Another, scrawled hurriedly, said, "He is here, watching." On the final page before the handwriting abruptly ended, Elijah wrote, "We are not alone in the trees." Forensic analysis confirmed the words were his, though the tone was unlike anything he had ever written before. David's journal told a similar story. Early entries were calm, almost academic, describing the stars and the history of Yosemite's granite dome. But his last few notes deeply unsettling. One read, "Voices outside the tent, whispering our name." Another, almost illegible, "Do not follow the lights." The handwriting on the final page broke into uneven, jagged lines, as though written in haste. Investigators admitted privately that the journals disturbed them more than the tent itself. "It didn't sound like them," one ranger recalled. "It sounded like two men being driven into fear." The FBI briefly stepped into the case after reviewing the symbols and writings. Though no evidence of a crime had been established, the unusual circumstances and the prominence of the victims drew federal interest. For weeks, agents interviewed locals, rangers, and even fringe religious groups rumored to frequent Yosemite. Some investigators suggested the possibility of an outside intruder, someone who had encountered the pastors and left behind the message. But no DNA, fingerprints, or foreign material was found on the journals, the Bible, or the symbol. It was as if the mark appeared out of nowhere. Speculation exploded online. Forums dedicated to strange disappearances circulated theories of cult activity in the Sierras, linking the symbol to obscure ritual. Others speculated the men had experienced some form of hysteria driven by isolation and weather. But these theories failed to explain the scrawled phrase, "He isn't gone," or the way both men appeared calm and uninjured in death. More sinister voices suggested play by an unknown individual or group. In every scenario, however, There were too many missing. Meanwhile, the families demanded answers. Standing outside a press conference in Yosemite, Rachel Brooks clutched her husband's Bible and begged authorities not to dismiss the... Something happened to them. Something no one wants to talk about. They weren't scared men. They weren't confused. If they wrote those words, it's because they saw something real. David's daughter echoed the sentiment, accusing officials of hiding information to avoid tarnishing Yosemite's reputation. The press conference ended in chaos, with questions shouted and unanswered. Despite the mounting pressure, officials released no definitive conclusion. The case file listed the cause of death as undetermined and described the symbol as of unknown origin. For the public, that vagueness infuriating the families. It was unbearable. The truth remained buried in the granite silence. The tent was packed into evidence storage, the journals sealed away. The case began its slow fade, but the mystery had only deepened, leaving a trail of symbols, fragmented words, and questions no one could. The autopsies only deepened the puzzle. Neither Elijah nor David bore significant injury, aside from small scratches consistent with hiking. Their lungs showed no water, ruling out drowning, and no fractures were found. Toxicology screens revealed no drugs or toxin. With no natural explanation and no visible trauma, coroners wrote the cause of death as undetermined. Families were left staring at paperwork that answered nothing, their grief sharpened by the void of explanation. Food and water supplies were still neatly arranged near the campsite. Their propane stove had been used only once, suggesting they hadn't eaten much after their arrival. Investigators found a half-empty bottle of water, still capped. This detail unsettled them. Dehydration is one of Yosemite's greatest dangers, yet the men had plenty of supplies left untouched. Why would two experienced campers, meticulous in preparation, suddenly stop taking care of their most basic needs? Stranger still were the cell phones. Both were recovered inside the tent, batteries drained but intact. Forensic analysis showed Elijah's last activity was a photo taken at sunset on September 18th. David's phone log revealed a half-typed text at 10:41 p.m. That same night. It read only, "We hear," before abruptly cutting off. The message was never sent. Investigators could not determine if the phone had been interrupted by a failing signal, a sudden shock, or something far more inexplicable. A fragment of hair was also found clinging to the tent's outer fabric. DNA testing confirmed it did not belong to either pastor nor to their immediate families. The sample was too degraded to match to anyone in national databases. Officials downplayed this finding, calling it inconclusive contamination, but to the families, it felt like proof that someone else had been there, someone who had vanished without leaving any further trace. That small strand of hair became another unsolved piece, growing puzzle. Locals added fuel to speculation. Several nearby hikers reported seeing strange lights in the trees on the night of September 9th. One described glowing orbs moving in silence across the ridges. Another swore she heard men shouting prayers deep in the forest. No one else could. Rangers dismissed these accounts as exaggeration, but they circulated quickly, feeding theories that something more than an accident had taken place in Yosemite. The whispers of cult activity resurfaced once more. Comparisons soon arose with older unsolved cases. Veteran rangers remembered hikers found dead under unusual circumstances, bodies without injuries, gear untouched, no signs of cause. Though none had drawn national headlines, the pattern troubled them. Yosemite has long been infamous for mysterious vanishing, many cataloged in local lore. Elijah and David's deaths now joined that dark archive, two more names etched into the wilderness's history of unanswered questions. In Oakland, theories divided the congregation. Some believed their pastors had been victims of a crime, the strange messages and symbols, proof of malevolent human presence. Others interpreted the evidence spiritually, claiming the men had encountered something divine or demonic in the mountain. The phrase, "He is not gone," was quoted in sermons, sometimes as a reassurance, sometimes as a warning. Grief became intertwined with theology, leaving the community fractured between faith and fear. For investigators, the case reached a dead end. With no clear cause of death, no identified intruder, and no definitive meaning behind the writings, the file remained open but inactive. Families left Yosemite with boxes of belongings that offered no answer, journals filled with fragmented words, phones that went silent mid-sentence, and a tent marked by a symbol no one could explain. What began as a camping trip had turned into a riddle, and Yosemite kept its secrets with an unsettling. In the months that followed, the case of Elijah Brooks and David Carter faded from headlines, but never from memory. The National Park Service quietly archived reports listing the deaths as unexplained. For the families, there was no closure, only questions that seemed to multiply. Rachel Brooks said she woke nightly from dreams of her husband calling her name from the forest. David's daughter admitted she could not step into a church without seeing the words, "He is not gone," etched across the sanctuary walls of her mind. Every September, the churches in Oakland held memorial service. Congregants sang the hymns the pastors were last heard singing around their fire, voices trembling with grief. Candles were lit for two men who had given their lives to faith, though no one could agree on how they. In these gatherings, grief often shifted into it. Some demanded that the government reopen while others believed they were facing something no official report could ever. The case developed a cult following online. Message boards, podcasts, and late-night radio shows dissected every known detail. Amateur sleuths claimed to decode hidden meanings in the strange symbol. Some argued it was connected to indigenous warning marks, though experts rejected the theory. Others claimed the journals hinted at UFO activity or secret experiments. The lack of firm answers gave free rein to speculation. Yosemite, once a symbol of beauty, became for many the stage of something dark and unspeakable. Rangers who had worked the case admitted privately that it stayed with them. Several described an oppressive silence revisiting the area, as though sound itself was swallowed. "I've been in those woods 1,000 times," a journalist, "but I've never felt anything like that. It's like the air changes around that." While officials dismissed such, the men and women who combed the terrain remained haunted by the families buried their grief. But the unresolved nature of the deaths. Rachel stopped camping, saying she could not look at a tent without. Marcus Carter, David's son, took to hiking the Sierras in search of peace, but said he never felt alone. "I always hear things," he confessed once, "branches breaking where nothing is. My dad used to say the woods were holy. Now they feel like they're hiding something." Locals, too, contributed to the myth. Some hikers claimed to hear faint singing at night in Tuolumne Meadows, hymns drifting in the wind. Others swore they saw ghostly lights weaving through the trees. Whether folklore or fear, these stories only reinforce the pastor's disappearance as part of Yosemite's eerie legacy. Guides began warning campers about the place of silence, though few admitted openly that they were referring to the site where Elijah and, despite renewed petitions, the case was never reopened. Officials maintained there was insufficient evidence to pursue foul play. The families were left with boxes of belongings, a tent never bear to look at again. In Oakland, their churches preserved the pastor's Bibles, relics of devotion. Visitors often paused at Elijah's Bible, still open to revelation, its red ink underlined stark and unsettling. No one could explain who had. By the 10th anniversary in 2023, the disappearance had transformed into legend. Documentaries revisited the story. Journalists retraced the pastor's steps, but no new evidence emerged. The mystery had hardened into something immovable, like the granite cliffs of Yosemite itself. For those who knew Elijah and David, the silence was unbearable. For others, it was magnetic, proof that some stories remain untouchable, sealed by a wilderness swallows answers whole. In October 2024, more than 11 years after the pastors vanished, two hunters from Fresno stumbled upon something while tracking deer near a remote ridge of Yosemite seldom visited. They followed a game trail that curved into a thicket of pine and granite when one noticed a scrap of weathered fabric caught on a branch. At first it looked like nothing, just sun-bleached canvas. But pulling it free, they realized it was part of a tent. Torn unevenly, its edges smeared with something dark and dried. Curious, the men pushed deeper, eventually reaching a shallow clearing where the soil seemed disturbed. Half buried beneath layers of leaves and moss lay a metal lockbox, badly rusted. Its surface was pitted and scarred, but it had clearly been forced open years before. Inside, the hunters found fragments of paper nearly illegible from moisture, and a small leather-bound notebook with initials carved into the cover. E.B. knowing of the famous disappearance, they froze. The notebook had survived the years, and the initials left no doubt who it belonged to. When turned over to authorities, the notebook revealed short, fragmented entries not included in the pastor's original journals. Written in Elijah's hand, the entries were erratic, with sentences scratched out and rewritten. One note read, "We followed the singing, but it was not human." Another page said, "David says we must not look directly. He is afraid, but I see light in the handwriting grew increasingly, with the final legible line stating, "It is not a man." After that, the pages became smeared, unreadable. Even more disturbing was what lay at the bottom of the box, a small metal cross bent out of shape, as though twisted by immense force. The families confirmed the cross had belonged to David, who never removed it from his neck. The idea that it had been wrenched from him and hidden away disturbed even the most skeptical investigator. Who had placed it in the box? And why had the box been buried so carefully, yet left in such an accessible place? The hunters described hearing something unsettling as they left the ridge that day. One swore he heard faint chanting echoing in the trees, though his companion insisted it was only the wind returned, telling local deputies they would never set foot again. It didn't feel like a hunting ground, one lay. It felt like a graveyard, or worse. Their unease only deepened the mystery surrounding the box and its contents. The discovery reignited media interest overnight. Headlines across California screamed of new evidence in Yosemite pastor's disappearance. Reporters swarmed the families, demanding reaction. Rachel Brooks broke down on camera, clutching the photograph of her husband she had carried for a decade. If that was his notebook, she said through tears, then he was still writing after they were supposed to be gone. That means someone was there with them, someone who didn't want us to know. Authorities tried to temper speculation, insisting the notebook contained no verifiable evidence of foul play. Yet they could not explain why it had never been logged in the original investigation, nor how it ended up buried so from the official camps. Officials quietly reopened the file, sending forensic teams back into the wilderness. Still, every trail was cold, every trace decades old. The granite had swallowed its secrets long before. For the families, the discovery reopened wounds. The idea that Elijah and David had written terrified words in their final, and that those words had been hidden, felt unbearable. The journals, the symbol, and now the buried lockbox seemed less like random and more like a chain of deliberate acts. The truth, however, remained just out of reach, taunting them from the shadows of Yosemite, as if the mountains themselves refused to let go of the story. The rediscovered notebook forced investigators to re-examine every fragment of the case, but answers never came. Specialists in handwriting confirmed the entries belonged to Elijah, yet could not explain the increasingly erratic scrawl. Linguists debated the phrases, not human, not looked directly, but no consensus formed. Was it the language of a man hallucinating from exhaustion, or a deliberate attempt to describe something beyond ordinary experience? No interpretation satisfied all who studied it. Search teams returned to the ridge where the lockbox was found, digging shallow trenches and scouring the surrounding forest. Aside from a few rusted tin cans and the skeleton of a deer, nothing more was uncovered. The soil revealed no clear burial sites, and ground-penetrating radar turned up no hidden remains. After weeks of effort, the renewed investigation was quietly scaled back. For many, the discovery felt like a cruel tease, proof that answers existed, but were destined to remain out of reach. The families, however, could not turn away. Rachel Brooks began carrying Elijah's rediscovered notebook everywhere she went, its damp, ruined pages preserved in a sealed bag. "He wrote this for us. Even if I don't understand it, it means he was alive. He was still trying." Marcus Carter, now in his 30s, admitted he sometimes wished the notebook had never been found. "It gave me hope for a week," he said, "and then it took that hope away again." Theories multiplied. Some claimed the men had stumbled into cult activity deep in and the writings ritual. Others believed they encountered something supernatural. The singing light, the twisting of the cross, the phrase, "He is not gone," all pointing toward forces beyond comprehension. Skeptics dismissed such claims, but even they struggled to explain why so many elements of the case defied ordinary patterns. In Yosemite itself, the area grew into an unspoken taboo. Rangers discouraged campers from straying near Tuolumne Meadows after dark, though no official warnings were ever issued. Hunters whispered about the ridge where the lockbox had been found, swearing that the air there felt colder, that the silence carried weight. A few curious explorers who attempted overnight stays near the site reported vivid nightmares and waking to the sound of faint hymns drifting between the trees. None stayed longer than a single night. The journals, the symbol, the bent cross, and the lockbox now formed a chain of artifacts that led nowhere. Each discovery raised new questions. Each theory collapsed under contradiction. The pastor's disappearance had grown into something larger than a single tragedy. It had become a riddle woven into Yosemite's landscape, one more haunting entry in a park that's seen too many vanish without explanation. For every family who hikes its trails, their story stands as a warning. Beauty and danger often walk side by side. By 2025, the official record remained unchanged, cause of death undetermined. For Rachel, for David's children, and for the congregation who still lit candles in September, the absence of truth was its own torment. They prayed for clarity, but prayers yielded only silence. That silence was the closest thing Yosemite would ever give to an answer. And so, the case of Elijah Brooks and David Carter remained unsolved, sealed beneath granite cliffs and whispering pines. Some believe the men found God in those woods in a way no one else could understand. Others insist they crossed paths with something darker, a presence that leaves only fragments, never explanation. Whatever the truth, the wilderness held it tightly, reminding all who enter that not every story is meant to be finished, and not every disappearance finds its way back into the light. And so the case of Elijah Brooks and David Carter remained unsolved, sealed beneath granite cliffs and whispering pine. Some believe the men found God in those woods in a way no one else understands. Others insist the crossed paths are darker, a presence that leaves only fragment, never explanation. Whatever the truth, the wilderness held it tightly, reminding all who enter that not every story is meant to be finished, and not every disappearance finds its way back into the light. If you stayed with me until the end of this chilling mystery, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us keep exploring stories that remain hidden